So you picked up Hades 2 and you left a negative review that looks a little bit something like this. Okay, maybe you're not that negative, but you're failing to deal damage to enemies and it's getting you a little frustrated. My name is Veedotme, and my goal for this video is to turn your damage from looking like this. That does no damage. Into looking a little bit like this. This is miles ahead of our last build already. Isn't that sad? If you think that's something you need, or if you're just interested in someone's point of view on damage, be sure to watch all of this video as we go through multiple different points. And if you end up learning something, consider subscribing because we post this kind of stuff all the time. Either way, let's get right into it. First and foremost, Hades 2 is a roguelite game. Say it with me, folks, roguelite with a T. This is not a game that you can beat on your first try.
So this is where the real action is, huh? Weren't you supposed to still be practicing?
When you install this game, a bunch of the features are missing because the game expects you to progress through its story, and to do that, you have to die. And trust me, I hate dying in roguelike games, but for a roguelite, it's actually important. So don't think that you're gonna do tons of damage in just your first 2 hours of the game. You won't even have access to all the features that let you do tons of damage. Once you get over that mental hurdle of the roguelite aspect, and especially once you start to immerse yourself in the story of Hades 2 and all the characters you're introduced to, you'll definitely find yourself enjoying the game a lot more. So you may be wondering, as a roguelite, what stuff am I missing to make like really strong builds? First and foremost, the easiest thing to mention is the Arcana cards. These are individual buffs that power up your run. I'm not going to mention those just yet, but there is a lot of passive power in here that's going to help you out later. As you play through more attempts at reaching Kronos, not even killing Kronos, just reaching them, you're going to be introduced to more gods, as well as some of the supporting cast, such as Chaos and Artemis. Most of these folks are not available until you get through what's considered the tutorials of the game, which is constant death.
Return to Shadow now.
As you keep going, you'll encounter more things like the hammers, Arachne's outfits, buffs from Narcissus, buffs from Echo, and more things that will actually move the needle in doing damage. But let's back up a bit to what you're probably going to experience the soonest, which is the Arcana card system.
The sorceress.
When you start off in Hades 2, your Arcana cards is going to look a little bit like this. Your end goal is for it to look a little bit like this. Even the first Arcana cards that you'll be introduced to are not typically ones that would increase your damage. The cards connect on the sides in which you unlock the previous card, which means that your first card, which is a slowdown effect, links with get more health, one that does increase damage of all the foes that are in your cast, so it's kind of specific. Then you get into more HP, more mana, and then finally another damage one, which is damage when you're low on mana. So when you think about it that way, you're not actually getting raw damage up in the way that you would think you are. It's not one of those roguelite games where you just pump up attack speed, like crit and things of that nature. It's a little bit deceptive, but from the Arcana cards in general, let's look at the two that you unlock pretty early. The Furies deal more damage in your cast. So when you lay down your cast, it's important to think about this is a button that the game is offering me. I may not even have a boon that's associated with it, but what it's supposed to do is lock down enemies. But that's not all it does. It's giving you a damage bonus if you're using that Arcana card. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but once you start to understand that this is a damage button alongside a crowd control button, that's going to start to increase your damage, especially later once you get a bit deeper in the game. The other Arcana card that we have is you get increased damage when your mana is less than 100%. What that means is the game wants you to use your mana. This could be an Omega attack, like we saw just now. It could be Omega Special, it could be Omega Cast. With just those two together, you're looking at a 50% damage bonus. You're already doing more damage now by simply holding down the circle button and then continuing on with your normal gameplay. But keep in mind, this is the kind of gameplay that Hades 2 wants from you, so you gotta learn this sooner rather than later.
I rise again.
And what I'm referring to, which is my third tip here, is to literally press all your buttons. Even in Hades 1, we had the same thing, where Zagreus has a regular attack, a special attack, a cast button, and then a call button. Hades 2 has the same stuff, except the call is replaced with her moon special, which, by the way, is something that's going to show up later as you die a little bit more. So in Hades 2, it's really important to think about each button has its own uses and should be used whenever possible until you hit a build where you don't want to use that button anymore. I've had lots of builds that were only square attack. I've had lots of builds that were triangle spam, which is special. And I've had builds that really need me to use the cast button. But until that happens, you should be getting used to using all of these buttons because they all have their purposes. As you start to play these weapons a little bit more and understand not only their kit, but how they do most of their damage, then you can start thinking about our next tip, which is how to pair the right boon with the right button. One of the earliest weapons you get in the game is the silver daggers. This is also the weapon that's shown in the trailer for Hades. This is a close range dagger, does about 22 damage per hit. Not a ton, but you can imagine that when playing a close range weapon like this, Aphrodite, who happens to buff all of your close range attacks, would be the absolute #1 choice here. And while 80% is definitely not a number to scoff at, there are actually other options you could be using that is just as good, if not better, than Aphrodite. If we look at Poseidon as an example, at base value, Poseidon does 15 extra damage with every attack. 15 doesn't sound like a good number, but in reality, 15 damage is 75% bonus damage on a 20 damage hit. It's actually 5% less damage than Aphrodite, but you are getting an AoE effect behind the monster, and then bonus damage if it splashes into the wall or into other monsters. And since the daggers aren't very good at AoE anyway, that's area of effect, then Poseidon actually works out extremely well. Compare that to something like the axe. A basic attack from an axe does 40 damage. So adding Poseidon boon to that is actually a 50% damage bonus, when you could be getting more benefit from Apollo, Aphrodite, or some of the other gods that you'll see later. Hestia can also be an example of a very deceptively powerful boon. She does quote-unquote flat damage on her Scorch effect, but it's not just that it's flat damage that does damage over time and then sort of scales as you apply more and more of it. Again, probably best to benefit a faster attack speed weapon or a weapon that fires multiple times. If I just press my special one time, it's gonna apply one instance of the Scorch, which really doesn't do all that much. If I hold down the button, we get to apply multiple instances of Scorch, and you can see that orange bar, that's the damage that Scorch is doing. So it's not really a good weapon to try to just like tag a monster and let it burn. That's not exactly how this boon works. It really excels when you apply a bunch of it. Even your sprint button can be actually very powerful. Hephaestus, for example, has bonus damage whenever you do a sprint. That sprint has to go for maybe like a full second before it detonates by the end. At base value, Smithy Sprint does 200 damage in an AoE around your character, and all you have to do is sprint for a second. At rare, it does 300 damage total, which is almost enough to kill most of the monsters in the first biome, all by itself. And this is repeatable. You may think to yourself that in a game like Hades, all you need to do is spam the attack button and I should be doing massive damage, but it's not that simple. Sometimes you need to utilize your sprint, sometimes you need to use your special, sometimes you need to use your cast. And then you have to pair your boons with things that make sense for that button. that will help supplement your weapon too. There is sort of one thing that is just raw damage up, and those are Chaos Gates. If you remember Chaos, it's the same as Hades 1. You sacrifice some of your HP, and then you do what amounts to a challenge in order to increase your damage in various ways. Here's a list of some deceptively powerful Chaos boons. Gaining 48 mana means that sprint that I was doing with Hephaestus, I could do that sprint almost 5 more times in every biome until I tap out on mana. Paralyzing Favor increases the rarity chance of boons that show up. If you recall, it was a 100 damage bonus going from common to rare on just the Hephaestus sprint. So that in turn is also a damage bonus. You have to think sort of long term here. What can Chaos do that will actually make my gameplay better rather than which one is a straight up attack up, special up, cast up? You may want to consider things like Omega Cast Time, which lets you hit your big DPS number faster. And I mean, if you hit attack up and special up, those are also very good, I'm sure. It won't always happen, so make sure you start thinking about what other things you can use with the Chaos. But hey, 60% bonus damage on this thing? Doing 140 in one hit? It's probably pretty strong. Just make sure that the boons and hammers that you have line up with that. Speaking of hammers, the hammers in Hades 1 were probably the most important part of build making. So in Hades 2, you get the same thing, if not better. Each hammer is super build defining for every single weapon that you pick up. Going back to the Twin Flame example, the regular Omega Special from Twin Flame looks a little bit like this. You may not particularly like the Omega Special on Twin Flame, but depending on your hammer choices and the boons that you ended up with, you could end up with an Omega Special that looks like this. Spins faster, +1 ammo, easier to stack the ability. If you're using Axe, you might be having a lot of fun with Omega Attack. Cast time is a little long, but when you start spinning, it looks pretty good. 500 damage total, definitely nothing to scoff at. But there are also hammers that just straight up remove the option to do Omega Attack, period. When you hold to attack, you actually strike 30% faster, but you can't do the Omega Attack. You can combine that with Hell's Splitter, which turns your attack into a big chop instead. So now you have a chop at higher attack speed, and you can go even further than that with Executioner's Chop, where the final move in your attack sequence hits 2 times but uses 20 mana. You can kind of see how powerful this becomes, and with Apollo, we're able to hit most of the map.
I think not.
And once you start seeing other cool NPCs like Artemis and Arachne, you'll end up getting a lot more interesting setups that give you all kinds of damage that you didn't even know was possible. This is unfair. To maximize your DPS in Hades 2, you need to understand the bosses that you're fighting. I don't want to spoil all the boss gameplay, but starting off with Hecate, my earliest fights versus Hecate were actually fairly long, and that's because I really didn't understand what she did. She fires out a ring that you can kind of dash into and do some damage. The ring stays out for quite a bit of time, and the hitbox is relatively small. She has a lot of wind up on all of her melee slashes. Each one of those is very easy to go behind the boss. I often find myself looking for any angle to deal damage in this fight, because after a while of understanding what she does, it ends up being much easier to just pump out constant damage. Versus Scylla, you're fighting against 3 different enemies, but understanding what you can do against them is still extremely powerful to get out more damage. In a fight like this, I'm also using my sprint quite a bit. Here's an example of a Scylla fight where I have Hestia Fire. The Ignites come out around me whenever I'm charging up an Omega spell, but of course, the Twin Fire is doing Omega whenever you're holding down the square button, so I'm constantly pumping out AoE fire, and you can see I'm stacking so much fire damage on the drummer. She dies without me really interacting with her at all. It's a difference in gameplay that's partly the build I have and partly the knowledge I've gained from a roguelite game of dying and retrying. If after this video you still think you might need a little bit of assistance in finding good builds to fight these bosses, I'm gonna hope to have some build videos up. But if there's anything that I can have you leave with, is to understand that in a roguelite like this, it will only ever get better for you. And that's not saying that you have to grind, it's more so the more fun you're having in the game, the better it's gonna get overall. If you learned anything from this video, or even just found it entertaining, leave it a like. YouTube loves when you do that. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more Hades, more Dead Cells, and other roguelikes that I play. And if you want to see me do this stuff live, check out my Twitch channel where I play these kind of games almost every single day. Either way, I'll catch you next time.